He didn't just shout it. He howled it. Nick Reiner, 32, stood in the courtroom with bloodshot eyes and a trembling jaw. And with the world watching, he screamed. He wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. And just like that, the trial wasn't about the murders anymore. It was about something much darker. Something buried behind the red carpets, the Oscars, the prestige. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. This wasn't a son testifying about his parents' deaths. This was an emotionally torched man peeling back the Hollywood curtain, revealing a legacy of manipulation, coldness, and family betrayal hidden behind the lens of one of America's most beloved filmmakers. So we have to ask, what really happened in that $13.5 million Brentwood estate? What happened behind the arched wooden doors, away from the smiling family portraits and film set glamour? And perhaps more importantly, why did it take 2 corpses and a courtroom meltdown to finally reveal the truth? Let's rewind. Rob Reiner, a name you probably associate with legendary films like A Few Good Men, The Princess Bride, and When Harry Met Sally. A Hollywood titan, a man celebrated not just for his talent, but for his values. Progressive, articulate, fatherly. A voice of reason in a chaotic world. But behind the camera, behind the accolades, there may have been another story unfolding. Because on Sunday, December 14th, Rob Reiner and his wife, the quiet and dignified Michelle Singer Reiner, were found stabbed to death inside their luxurious Brentwood estate. The LAPD described the scene as methodical but intimate. The wounds were sharp, deep, and deliberate. There were no signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. And standing just feet away from the blood-soaked floor, barely coherent, was their son, Nick Reiner. He lived in the guest house. He had a key, and according to sources, he hadn't left the property all weekend. Now, if that was all there was to this story, it would still be tragic. A horrific tale of familial violence. The kind that ends up in true crime documentaries and late-night talk show punchlines. But this went somewhere else entirely. Because in the weeks that followed, during court appearances, psychiatric evaluations, leaked evidence, and one unforgettable courtroom outburst, Nick didn't try to defend himself. He didn't deny it. He didn't cry for help. He didn't beg for mercy. Instead, he spoke with the eerie precision of a man who had spent years rehearsing this moment. And what he revealed about his father wasn't just damning. It was soul-shattering. Now, let's pause here. You might be asking, why does this matter? Why should we care what some troubled Hollywood son said about his famous dad in court? Here's why. Because this isn't just a murder trial. It's a mirror. A mirror held up to fame, family, and the rot that can grow behind even the most beautiful facades. It's about the psychological toll of being born into a legacy you never asked for. It's about the blurred line between parenting and performance. And it's about what happens when your life has been so meticulously scripted by others that your only unscripted moment is an explosion of violence. Let's talk about Nick for a moment. He wasn't some anonymous trust fund kid with a dark secret. He was a child of Hollywood, raised among legends, interviewed in Variety, posed next to film legends at age 6, sent to elite boarding schools, rehab centers, creative writing retreats. On paper, Nick had every advantage. But the truth? Nick didn't want the spotlight. He hated it. He once told a therapist, according to leaked notes, "I don't know who I am. I know who they want me to be, but that's not me." He struggled with identity, with addiction, with approval, and at the center of it all, a father who, by Nick's own words, saw me as a script he could rewrite, not a son he could love. We're going to take you deep inside the Reiner home, not the one on Zillow, but the emotional home, the one Nick grew up in. You'll hear leaked audio of family arguments. You'll see private diary entries recovered from Michelle's nightstand. You'll learn about the surveillance tapes, the missing housekeeper, the secret therapy notes, and even a screenplay. Yes, a screenplay that might have predicted it all. Because here's the most chilling twist of all. Nick may have written this story long before the murders happened. But before we get there, before we dive into the crime scene analysis, the guest house isolation, the courtroom chaos, and the final blood-stained revelations, here's something you need to keep in mind. This isn't just about a murder. It's about masks. The ones we wear for the public, the ones we wear for our families, and the ones we wear for ourselves. until they crack. Still think this is just another Hollywood scandal? Then answer this. Why did Nick scream that line? So specific, so cinematic, so cutting, that it stopped even the judge in his tracks? He wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. And what did Nick mean when, moments later, he added, almost under his breath, and the scene finally ended? Was it a metaphor? Or was it a confession? Over the next 13 chapters, you're going to uncover every hidden thread. You'll learn things even the courtroom audience didn't hear. You'll hear things the jury was forbidden to consider. And just when you think you've seen the full picture, a new frame will be revealed. Because like any great director, Rob Reiner knew how to control a narrative. But now, his son is telling the story. And what comes next will change how you see everything. 1 hour after the police found the bodies, investigators opened a drawer in Rob's private study. Inside was a tape recorder. Old, dusty, still warm. It had just finished recording. The label? Final draft, December 14th. And what was on that tape? Well, that's where our story begins. What if the final moments of Rob Reiner's life were recorded, not by accident, but by design? The old recorder clicked off sometime between 2:12 and 2:19 a.m. There was no one else in the room. No lights. Just the blinking red dot. The last line caught on the tape? A whisper. Tight. Controlled. Like a director cueing his last shot. Don't forget your mark. Then silence. But what happened before that? What happened inside that $13.5 million Brentwood estate in the hours before Hollywood's golden couple were found lying in pools of blood? Let's walk through it together. Not like a crime show. Not like tabloid junk. Let's walk through it like we're there. Because the Reiner house didn't just hide a crime scene. It hid a scripted implosion of a family dynasty. And someone, maybe everyone, saw it coming. The police received the 911 call at 3:07 a.m. Caller, Romy Reiner. Location, front entrance of the estate. Status, hysterical, possibly in shock, according to dispatch logs. Her voice was barely audible through sobs. They're dead. Oh my God. My mom, my dad, and Nick, he's in the guest house. He won't come out. It took less than 6 minutes for LAPD units to arrive. By the time they pulled up the long stone driveway, Romy was pacing barefoot, in pajamas, covered in what appeared to be blood, later confirmed to be Michelle's. Her hands were shaking. Her mouth kept repeating the same phrase. It was just dinner. Just dinner. Inside the main house, 2 bodies were found. One in the kitchen, the other in the den. No forced entry. No signs of robbery. No shattered glass. No broken locks. No struggle. At least not the kind you'd expect from a home invasion. Just stillness. And red. Lots of red. Let's start with Michelle. She was found in the kitchen, slumped against the refrigerator, her right hand gripping a butcher knife. Not the murder weapon, mind you. This one was clean, but clenched, almost defensively. Her left hand was open. Blood pooled beneath it. A phone lay beside her. The screen cracked. The number 9 was punched in. Not 911. Just 9. She never finished dialing. Her wounds? 8 stab wounds to the abdomen. 1 to the neck. The fatal one, a deep plunge between the ribs. Precise, not frenzied. And here's the part investigators can't forget. There was a fully set table 15 feet away. 2 glasses of red wine. 3 dinner plates. 3. Why 3? Who was the third guest? Now to Rob. He was found lying face up in the den. A shallow pool of blood beneath him, soaking into a Persian rug reportedly gifted by Steven Spielberg. His expression? Calm. That's what threw detectives off. No signs of panic. No defensive wounds. Just one clean, downward stab wound through the chest. Almost theatrical, like a scene from one of his movies. Near his hand was a leather-bound notebook. His writing journal. The last line, scribbled in black ink. Sometimes you direct the ending. Sometimes the ending directs you. Sound like something a man would write moments before death? Or someone else did? And more importantly, was that note written for someone? Let's go back to the beginning of that day. According to the estate's digital entry logs, Nick entered the main house at 6:12 p.m. He used the code, his own code, to unlock the side door. Security logs confirm no alarm was triggered. At 6:27 p.m., the smart oven in the kitchen was turned on. Roasted duck, one of Michelle's favorites. 7:05 p.m., cameras in the hallway, motion activated, captured Rob walking toward the kitchen. He was alone. 7:13 p.m., the cameras stop. Not just that one. All of them. The security system was deactivated manually using the master code, accessed from the wall panel in Rob's office. Who knew that code? Only Rob, Michelle, and Nick. Now here's where things get eerie. The crime scene was too clean. Not in the usual sense. There was plenty of blood. But the lack of chaos, the intentionality, the calmness of it all. Veteran crime scene techs said it felt staged. Like someone was recreating something. Not reacting, but performing. And tucked under a book on Rob's desk, beneath a copy of The Art of War, they found something else. A screenplay, titled The Guest House, written by Nick Reiner. Unpublished. Undated. But here's what shook the detectives. The screenplay detailed a tense family dinner between a washed-up director, his fragile wife, and their resentful son. The climax? The son snaps. He kills both. He stages the scene. Then he sits quietly in the guest house, waiting to be found. Sound familiar? Let's talk about the knife. The murder weapon was found in the sink. Washed. Still wet. No fingerprints. No prints at all. Not even from the housekeeper who normally cleaned up after dinner. LAPD confirmed the knife matched the wounds. But there was something strange. The handle had been wrapped in gauze. From where? Nick's room. A matching roll of gauze was discovered under his pillow. His DNA was found on that, but not the knife. Again, too clean. Too precise. Like someone wanted the cops to notice. What about the guest house? The cops approached it around 3:45 a.m. Lights were on. Curtains drawn. They knocked. No answer. They knocked again. Nothing. Finally, they used a master key. Inside, Nick was sitting on the couch, wearing headphones, watching Stand By Me. He looked up, didn't flinch, didn't cry, didn't scream. He said one thing. I was wondering when you'd come in. Chills, right? But it gets stranger. Because on the table next to him was a journal. His own. Open to a page marked. Tonight, final scene. The entries simply read. They never saw the real me. They only saw the character. Tonight, I take off the mask. Let's pause. Are you beginning to see the picture forming? This wasn't just a double homicide. This was deliberate, personal, scripted. And when investigators reviewed phone records, they noticed something disturbing. Rob had called his lawyer at 6:45 p.m. 3 times. No voicemail. Just the call. And that lawyer? He's refused to speak to press. One source claims Rob was trying to finalize a document. Something about changing family trust access. We don't have the full details yet. But what we do know, that document never got signed. And the lawyer? He received one final text from Rob that night at 7:10 p.m. Never mind. It's too late. And then, the final clue. Inside the den, tucked behind the record player, police found a small metallic tape recorder. The one we mentioned earlier. Still warm. Still running. It had just finished. The tape is now sealed in evidence. But a leak, verified by multiple sources, says this. The final 7 minutes captured a tense conversation between Rob and Nick. No yelling. No crying. Just a low, icy conversation. Rob allegedly says, "You always hated the spotlight, but you were born in it." Nick replies, "And you were never a father. Just a director, playing a role you couldn't stop performing." Then a silence. And finally, Rob, "Don't forget your mark." End of tape. You still think this was spontaneous? You still think this wasn't personal? Because the truth is, the murder scene wasn't just a scene of death. It was a stage. And the audience, us, the public, we were always going to be the final spectators. But what comes next? That's where it all flips. Because after the bodies were taken, the evidence bagged, the headlines written, something strange happened at the morgue. A discovery. A clue no one expected. And it didn't come from the knife. Or the blood. Or the house. It came from inside Rob Reiner's jacket. Something folded, taped, and handwritten. And when the technician unfolded it, they found 3 words. Words that would change the direction of the case. Words that, once leaked, sent shockwaves through Hollywood. They said, "Ask the daughter." What if the person everyone thought they knew never actually existed? The note found in Rob's jacket said 3 words. Ask the daughter. That message didn't just point investigators toward Romy. It cracked open something far more unsettling. Because to understand what happened in that house, you don't start with the knife. You don't start with the blood. You start with the boy, Nick Reiner, the kid in the background of photos, the quiet one at premieres, the son who smiled when the cameras were on and disappeared when they weren't. So let me ask you something. How well do we really know the children of powerful people? And what happens when a child grows up feeling like an accessory instead of a person? Nick was born into a world most people only see from a distance. Red carpets, flashing cameras, private screenings, conversations with adults who spoke in metaphors, deals, and scripts. From the outside, it looked like privilege. From the inside, Nick later described it as living on a soundstage where the lights never turn off. According to people who knew him growing up, Nick wasn't loud. He wasn't rebellious in the traditional sense. He was withdrawn, observant, always watching. Teachers described him as intelligent but disengaged, creative but paralyzed by self-doubt. A child who wrote short stories that ended abruptly, like he didn't know how to finish a thought. One former tutor recalled something chilling. Nick once asked me if people still existed when no one was watching them. Think about that. That's not a normal childhood question. That's a kid trying to figure out whether he's real or just being perceived. Nick's childhood home wasn't chaotic. It was controlled. Schedules, public appearances, carefully planned family moments. Even dinner had a rhythm. Sit, smile, listen. Nick once joked, half not, that his father gave notes after conversations. Less emotion, more clarity. Try that again. People laughed. Nick didn't. Because when your parent is a storyteller by trade, you start wondering something dangerous. Are they listening to you? Or are they editing you? As Nick grew older, the comparison started. Not from strangers, from insiders. Are you going to follow in your father's footsteps? You must have stories. You're so lucky. Lucky. That word followed Nick everywhere. And it slowly became poison. Because luck implies gratitude. And gratitude implies silence. You don't complain if you're lucky. You don't struggle if you're lucky. You don't hurt if you're lucky. So Nick learned to shut down. By his teenage years, Nick had already been in and out of therapy. Officially, it was for anxiety. Unofficially, according to one leaked therapist summary later entered into evidence, Nick expressed something deeper. I feel like I exist to validate someone else's identity. That someone else he never named. But the implication was clear. Let's talk about Rob. Not as a villain, not as a hero, but as a presence. Rob was commanding, charismatic, intellectually intimidating. In public, he was warm. In private, according to Nick, he was distant. Not cruel, not abusive, just absent in a very specific way. Nick once described it like this. He was always there, and never with me. That contradiction matters. Because emotional absence doesn't leave bruises. It leaves confusion. You start blaming yourself. Am I boring? Am I disappointing? Am I not worth improvising for? Michelle tried to bridge the gap. Friends said she was gentle, observant, deeply empathetic. But even she was caught in the gravitational pull of Rob's world. And Nick knew it. He once told a friend, she loves me, but she loves him more. That's not resentment. That's grief. By his early 20s, Nick tried to define himself outside the family name. He wrote, not screenplays at first. Short fiction, essays, dark, introspective pieces about identity and erasure. But every time someone read his work, the reaction was the same. This is good, but have you thought about film? No matter where he turned, the shadow followed. So Nick did what many children of fame do. He self-destructed quietly. Substances, isolation, long stretches of silence. Not dramatic spirals, just slow erosion. One former partner said Nick had a habit of disappearing emotionally mid-conversation. It was like he'd suddenly leave the room without moving. Now here's where things take a turn. Because around the time Nick moved back into the guest house, something changed. He stopped numbing himself. He started observing again. But this time with purpose. He kept journals, recorded conversations, collected phrases, not evidence, material. Nick told a therapist, I think my whole life was research. Research for what? At the time, no one knew. Let's go back to that screenplay found on Rob's desk, The Guest House. Investigators initially dismissed it as metaphor. But people close to Nick weren't surprised. Because Nick had been talking about structure a lot. Beginnings, rising tension, unavoidable endings. One friend recalled Nick saying, some stories don't let you leave early. That wasn't a threat. It was resignation. And then there's Romy. The note said, asked the daughter, because Romy saw something no one else did. She saw the dynamic from the outside and the inside. The golden child? No, Romy was the witness. And in a private message later leaked, she wrote something haunting. Nick didn't hate Dad. He hated being invisible to him. That distinction changes everything. So ask yourself this. What happens when a person spends their entire life feeling like a background character? What happens when the only way they feel seen is to take control of the narrative? Nick didn't want attention. He wanted authorship. And that's where this story stops being about anger and starts becoming about inevitability. Because when someone believes their life has been written for them, there are only two choices. Keep reading the script or tear it apart. And remember that tape recorder? The one labeled Final Draft, December 14th. It wasn't the first recording. Investigators would later discover others. Earlier drafts, practice runs, moments Nick captured, not to expose, but to understand. Because Nick wasn't planning a crime. He was preparing for a conclusion. And in his mind, conclusions don't just happen. They're directed. Which brings us to the next question. If Nick was the child of silence, who taught him to speak this way, who showed him how to frame moments, control tone, and deliver lines that would echo long after the room went quiet? Because in the next chapter, we're going to pull back the curtain on the Reiner household itself. Not the house. The system. The unspoken rules. The emotional contracts. The performances everyone pretended were love. And once you see how that family functioned, you may realize the ending wasn't as shocking as it seemed. It was rehearsed. Weeks before the murders, Nick sent an email to himself. No subject line. Just one sentence. If they won't hear me as a son, they'll hear me as a character. And attached to that email, a family dinner transcript, marked in red ink, with stage directions. What if your family didn't raise you? They cast you? The transcript Nick emailed himself, a chilling reenactment of a family dinner, wasn't just a fantasy. It was a reconstruction, a scripted scene based on something very real, something painfully, eerily familiar. Investigators called it creative writing. The defense called it fiction. But the Reiner house staff? They called it Tuesday night. Because what Nick had written wasn't speculative drama. It was routine. A family that didn't just perform in public, but lived in performance. So here's the real question. If a child grows up inside a home where love is rehearsed, approval is conditional, and attention is performative, do they ever truly learn what's real? Or do they grow up believing that every relationship, every word, every silence, is a scene waiting to be directed? The Reiner family projected an image of sophistication and stability. Hollywood's intellectual elite. Not the messy, scandal-prone, tabloid-ready kind. The refined kind. They dined with senators. They supported social causes. They stayed married for decades. But behind that curated stability, there were layers. Layers of control, unspoken contracts, and a silence so thick, it spoke louder than arguments ever could. Let's start with the home itself. The Brentwood estate. To outsiders, it was a modern masterpiece. Open spaces, minimalist art, floor-to-ceiling glass that captured the California sun. But to those who spent time inside, it felt more like a museum than a home. Staff described the atmosphere as clinical, choreographed, beautiful but cold. One longtime housekeeper, speaking anonymously, said this. Everything was perfect until someone spoke. What she meant was, the illusion worked as long as no one broke character. Dinner was a ritual, not a bonding ritual, a production. The table was always set by 6:30 p.m. 3 plates. 3 napkins. 3 glasses. No phones allowed. Small talk permitted. Silences frowned upon. Rob sat at the head. Michelle beside him. Nick across. Always across. Never next to. Never too close. Conversations were intellectual. Debates. Film references. Politics. And yet, deeply impersonal. Nick once said in therapy, I learned early that you had to say something interesting, not honest. That's a devastating lesson for a child. Because it teaches you that your value isn't who you are, it's what you say. Rob was a master of articulation. He could spin any moment into a teachable metaphor. He loved analogies. He loved commentary. He loved being the smartest man in the room. And he usually was. But being right isn't the same as being warm. And Nick? Nick stopped trying to compete. Instead, he observed. He took notes. One therapist noted, Nick doesn't express emotions. He quotes them. Let that sink in. He didn't say what he felt. He repeated lines he'd heard before. Lines from scripts, from interviews, from his father, almost like he was learning how to be a person by watching one perform. Michelle played the quiet counterbalance. She wasn't cold. She wasn't domineering. She was distant in a different way. Affectionate but distracted. Present but passive. She adored Rob. Not blindly, but fully. Some say she excused his detachment because she understood it. Others say she enabled it. Nick once wrote, "Mom was like a lamp. She lit up whatever space you put her in, but she never moved on her own." Was that fair? Maybe not. But it gives us insight into what Nick saw. A mother who reflected warmth, but couldn't protect. A father who commanded presence, but couldn't connect. A family that looked whole, but functioned like a production crew. Everyone had a job. Everyone had a line. Nick had only one place where he felt real. The guest house. His retreat. His cave. His studio. He called it the void. Friends who visited said it was filled with storyboards, timelines, sticky notes, journals. But not scripts. Never scripts. Just raw pieces of thought. Emotional fragments. Dreams. Half-poems. Broken metaphors. Nick wasn't planning a movie. He was trying to make sense of memory. He told a friend once, "The only way I know something happened is if I write it down. Not film it. Not talk about it. Write it." That's not nostalgia. That's dissociation. As Nick entered adulthood, there were moments of hope. He got sober, for a while. He co-wrote a screenplay that made it to Sundance. But every success was met with something chilling. Indifference. At least from Rob. According to leaked texts, when Nick texted his father excitedly about the film festival, Rob replied, "Keep pushing. First drafts are never the final word." On paper, it's solid advice. From a father? It's heartbreaking. Nick didn't want notes. He wanted recognition. He wanted his father to put down the metaphorical pen and say, "That's my son. I'm proud of him." It never came. The turning point? 2 years before the murders. Nick moved back into the guest house. He told friends it was temporary. He was helping his parents during a rough patch. But others knew better. He was broke, disconnected, and, according to his sister Romy, emotionally unraveling. Romy wrote in a private DM, Nick wasn't spiraling like people think. He was slowing down, like someone waiting for the end of a scene. And here's where it gets surreal. Because during that time, Nick began recording conversations. Not secretly, openly. He told his parents it was for a memoir. Rob didn't object. He probably thought it was a phase. Michelle smiled politely. No one took it seriously. But Nick wasn't joking. He recorded everything. Dinner table debates, silent breakfasts, arguments about house staff, phone calls, even therapy sessions. With his own commentary added in after. It was all part of the process. One of his journals simply read, "If this is my life, I should at least be the narrator." So here's the paradox. The Reiner family never screamed at each other. They didn't throw plates. They didn't explode. They performed. They redirected. If someone got too emotional, the tone would shift. Someone would quote a movie. Someone would change the subject. Someone would leave the room. Conflict didn't end. It dissolved. And that left Nick with nowhere to place his pain. So he placed it on the page. And when pages weren't enough, he wrote scenes. By the time of the murders, Nick had constructed a mythology. Not out of hate, out of need. He wasn't trying to destroy his parents. He was trying to find a version of them that made sense. But when the real people didn't match the narrative, something snapped. Something fundamental broke. And in the hours before that final, fatal night, Nick made a choice. A tragic, devastating choice. Not to lash out, but to end the scene. Let's go back to the tape recorder. The one left running in Rob's study. It captured more than just the final moments. It captured a chilling exchange. "Michelle, you're not saying this because you believe it. You're saying it because you wrote it." Nick, "Does it matter?" Rob, "Everything matters when it's being watched." Nick, "Then let's make this ending matter." Those words weren't rage. They were direction. So now ask yourself, was Nick a killer? Or was he a tragic product of a family that never learned to live unscripted? Because in the next chapter, we step into Nick's last months in the guest house. The isolation, the patterns, the signs no one acted on, and the quiet rehearsal for an ending no one wanted to believe was coming. What if the safest place in your life slowly became your prison? From the outside, the Reiner guest house looked like a dream, tucked behind a grove of sculpted trees and bordered by an ivy-covered stone path. It was a two-story, 1,200-square-foot luxury suite with a private entrance, modern appliances, and more security than some embassies. But for Nick Reiner, it wasn't freedom. It was a padded room, without the padding. This was where the final act began, the final unraveling. The silent rehearsal for a tragedy that would one day explode into blood, screams, and a tape recorder left running. So how did it start? Let's walk into the guest house and back in time. When Nick returned to Brentwood in 2023, it wasn't with enthusiasm. It was desperation. He'd just left another failed writing retreat in Northern California. His most recent script had been rejected by every studio he submitted it to, including one that had previously offered him a deal. And his bank account? Less than $1,000. That's when Michelle called. The conversation was short. Come home for a while. Just until things settle. Nick didn't fight it. Maybe a part of him even wanted it. But if he thought home meant warmth, reconciliation, or healing, he was wrong. What he walked into was a mausoleum of control. At first, it seemed normal. Rob barely acknowledged him. Michelle set him up in the guest house, stocked the fridge, gave him a code for the main house. There were rules. Dinner was at 7 p.m. Use the side entrance. Let the housekeeper know before entering the main house uninvited. It wasn't spoken like a contract, but it felt like one. Nick started to document it all. One of his journals from the first week back reads, Day 3, no eye contact from Rob. Day 4, Michelle made soup. Left it at my door. Didn't knock. Day 5, ate alone. Again, these aren't entries from a guest. These are the writings of someone under emotional house arrest. As the weeks turned into months, patterns formed. Nick would wake around 2 p.m., make coffee, write until 4 o'clock or 5 p.m., then disappear into his own mental maze. He rarely entered the main house unless invited. He didn't attend family events. He didn't answer calls from Romy. He didn't leave the property. The guest house had everything he needed, except human contact, which, some say, was the point. A family friend stated, it wasn't punishment, but it wasn't support either. It was like containment. What no one realized, or admitted, is that Nick was spiraling inward. He stopped writing full scripts. He started compiling scenes from memory, arguments, awkward silences, forgotten birthdays, passive-aggressive remarks. He cataloged them obsessively. One document on his laptop titled Family Notes, 1997 to 2023, contained hundreds of entries. Short ones, long ones, disconnected, cryptic, raw. Mom said, you look tired, equals translation, you're disappointing your father again. Dad stared at me for 10 seconds. Said nothing. Walked away. That silence louder than any scream. Nobody remembers I existed at the When Harry Met Sally anniversary dinner. He wasn't editing his past. He was collecting it like evidence. Then there was the security system. One night, at 3:12 a.m., the guest house camera recorded something strange. Nick standing in the backyard. Not pacing, not exercising, just standing, still, for 23 minutes, looking up at the main house. He never moved. Never blinked, as far as the low-resolution footage could show. When investigators asked why, Nick's only response was, I was trying to figure out if I was on the outside looking in or already trapped inside. That wasn't metaphor. That was Nick's reality. Romy visited once during this time. She told a friend later, I didn't recognize him. Not his face, his presence. He didn't blink when I hugged him. She tried to talk. He gave one-word answers. She brought up old memories. Childhood trips, goofy moments, laughter. He stared at her and said, that version of me doesn't live here anymore. And that was the end of the visit. She left crying. He didn't watch her go. Another clue came from the housekeeper. She noticed something odd. Every night, like clockwork, Nick would bring a small black box into the backyard. A recorder. Analog. Old-fashioned. The kind with tapes. He'd place it on the table, sit across from it, and talk. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just talk. One night, she heard. Rehearsal. Scene 1. Family dinner. Another night. Rehearsal. Scene 2. The apology that never came. And the one before the murders? Final scene. December 14th. No rewrites. What makes this even more disturbing is what he was not doing. He wasn't drinking. He wasn't using drugs. He wasn't lashing out. There were no warning signs, at least not the kind most people look for. But there were clues. And now, in hindsight, they scream. Emails to himself marked, notes for the final scene. Google searches like, symbolic meanings of knives. How to stage a scene like a suicide. Best dialogue for courtroom reveal. At the time, it could have been research. But now, it reads like a blueprint. And then, there was the binder. Found after the murders. In his closet. Locked. Inside. Printed pages. Notes. Scene breakdowns. Dialogue samples. Family photographs annotated with stage directions. Mom, soft lighting. Smile like you're tired but trying. Dad, sits like a judge. Glances up like reading a review. Me, hands in lap. Look down. Don't cry. Pages and pages of this. It was chilling. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was clinical. This wasn't rage. It was dissection. Nick wasn't emotional. He was observational. One night, about 2 weeks before the murders, the housekeeper overheard Michelle on the phone. She was whispering, "I think he's planning something, but I don't know what." He doesn't talk. He just watches. Who was she talking to? We don't know. The phone call was never traced. But the day after that conversation, Michelle bought a small safe. It was found under her bed. Inside, 2 things. A handwritten letter and a USB drive. The letter said, "If anything happens, this wasn't random." The USB drive? Encrypted. Still being analyzed. So where was Rob in all this? He noticed. Of course he did. But did he act? According to Romy, he once told her, "Nick's always been dramatic. He'll write his way through it." That might have been true once. But not anymore. By now, Nick wasn't writing to survive. He was writing to conclude. The last journal entry Nick wrote before the murders? "I've tried being the son. I've tried being the student. Now, I'll try being the author." 1 scene. 2 exits. Fade to black. And that's where the paper ends. Mini cliffhanger ending. The night before the murders, the housekeeper found a script page taped to the fridge in the guest house. Typed. Centered. No title. No credits. Just 1 line. Int. Dining room. Night. The scene begins. No one survives. And in the top corner, a sticky note. Written in Nick's handwriting. Ready? What if the worst night of someone's life didn't happen in chaos, but in choreography? That's what made it all so disturbing. This wasn't a frenzied crime. It wasn't spontaneous. It was timed. Every step, every movement, every breath, planned like a shot list, executed like a final scene. Because what happened that night wasn't just the end of a family. It was the conclusion of a script Nick Reiner had been writing in his head for years. Let's walk through that night. Not like detectives. Not like voyeurs. Let's walk through it like readers of a final chapter. One where everyone had a role, but only one person had the pen. December 14th, 5:42 p.m. Michelle's phone logs show a brief call to a local organic grocery store. She ordered a duck breast, root vegetables, and 2 bottles of Merlot. A simple dinner. A normal dinner. But the surveillance footage from the grocery delivery van shows something odd. Michelle didn't answer the door. Nick did. And he smiled. He even tipped. 6:12 p.m. Nick uses his security code to enter the main house. This is confirmed by a digital ping on the doorframe's keypad. He's wearing dark jeans, a white t-shirt, and carrying a black messenger bag. The same bag police later find in the guest house, empty. What was in it that night? It's never found. 6:18 p.m. Kitchen smart oven logs show it was preheated to 375 degrees Fahrenheit. The duck was placed inside 5 minutes later. Cameras in the hallway catch Michelle moving back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room, setting the table. 2 wine glasses. 3 plates. 3. Why 3? She and Rob. And Nick? That's the assumption. But detectives would later question that. Why 3 if Nick had been eating alone for months? Had something changed? Had something been said? Or was Michelle afraid? Trying to appease? Trying to prevent something? 6:47 p.m. Rob arrives. He's seen entering through the side entrance, carrying a leather folder and a laptop. He smiles faintly at the camera, unaware this will be the last time he's recorded alive. His phone buzzes. He checks it. Doesn't answer. That missed call. From his lawyer. A man Rob had spoken to 3 times earlier that day. What were they discussing? Financial documents. Changes to the family trust. Documents that were never signed. documents that would have cut Nick out of several long-term arrangements. Coincidence? Or was Rob too late? 7:03 p.m. All interior cameras go dark. Not just paused. Disabled. Manually. From the wall-mounted control system in Rob's office. The code entered? Nick's. His was the only access code used between 7 p.m. and 3 a.m. After that, nothing. No motion. No pings. Just silence. But what we do have are sounds, captured by one tiny detail everyone forgot. Michelle had left her phone recording. A voice memo, titled, "Family Dinner, Trying Again." Was she documenting reconciliation? Was she afraid? Was this her way of leaving proof? We may never know. But what the audio revealed changed everything. 7:12 p.m. to 7:35 p.m. The voice memo picks up ambient kitchen noises. Clinking, chopping, oven beeps. Then voices. Michelle. He looks tired. Rob. He always looks tired when he's trying to prove something. Nick. I'm just trying to eat. Rob. You're always trying. Try finishing something. Michelle. Not tonight, please. Rob. This is what happens when you don't raise someone, you direct them. Silence. Nick. Thank you for dinner, Mom. It was your last good performance. A chair scrapes. The audio becomes chaotic. Shuffling. Something clatters, possibly a plate. Then breathing. Close. Labored. Then a wet, muffled sound. Repeated. Followed by silence. Then footsteps. The microphone remains live for another 19 minutes. But no words. Just a faint hum. Like someone pacing. Or maybe composing. 8:04 p.m. The smart lights in the kitchen are turned off via mobile app. Nick's phone. 8 seconds later, the lights in the den flicker and go dark too. Nick moves between rooms, turning off lights as he goes. Like a director wrapping the set. 8:23 p.m. A neighbor's doorbell camera across the street captures the faint echo of a woman's scream. It's distant. No one reports it. Not until after the news breaks the following day. 9:01 p.m. Nick returns to the guest house. The outdoor camera pings his movement. He walks slowly. He's carrying something under his arm. Possibly a journal. Possibly the tape recorder. He disappears inside. 10:34 p.m. Smart TV in the guest house powers on. Title, Stand By Me. One of Rob's most iconic films. A coming-of-age story about death, identity, and trauma. Nick watches it alone. For the 14th time that month. We know this because the streaming service kept a record. He paused once. At the 58-minute mark. The scene where the boys find the dead body. Nick rewound it. Played it again. And again. 3 times. 11:46 p.m. Nick sends a text. One word. To a number saved as R. Presumed to be Romy. The word? Sorry. She never saw it. Her phone was off. She was at a dinner across town. By the time she got home, her parents were gone. 2:19 a.m. The analog tape recorder in Rob's office clicks off. Runtime, 67 minutes. Investigators later retrieve the tape. We covered some of its final lines in Chapter 1. But there's one part we didn't share before. A whisper from Michelle. Barely audible. Cracked with emotion. He's not angry. He's empty. Then Rob. That's worse. Then Nick. No. That's honest. And then silence. 3:07 a.m. 911 is called. By Romy. Sobbing. Incoherent. Police arrive minutes later. Nick is in the guest house. Sitting. Waiting. When they enter, he says, I finished it. Finished what? They ask. He doesn't respond. Instead, he points to the table. There, laid out in perfect symmetry, is a script. 3 pages. Titled, Final Scene, directed by N.R. And on the last page, a single line, typed in bold. Cut to black. So what really happened that night? Did Nick kill out of rage? Out of resentment? Or did he kill to end something that, to him, had become unbearable? A family that wasn't a family. A life that wasn't his. A role he never asked to play. We can't pretend to understand his mind. But we can understand the build-up. The cues. The pauses. The look in his eyes when police found him. Not fear. Not pride. Just release. Like someone stepping out of character for the first time in their life. But there's one more thing. One detail not reported in the news. Not shared in court transcripts. Something found days after the murders. Taped under the dining room table. A flash drive. Tiny. Obscure. Inside. A video. Black screen. No faces. Just Nick's voice. Reading something. Calm. Measured. Quiet. If you're watching this, you probably hate me. That's okay. I didn't do this for you. I did this for the version of me that never got to speak. The child behind the camera. The ghost at dinner. The extra in a family drama that ran too long. He pauses. Then ends with. Scene complete. Curtain down. Then the screen cuts out. And silence. Mini cliffhanger ending. But just when investigators thought they had heard Nick's last words, a second video surfaced. Not from the night of the murders, but from a week before. A rehearsal. Nick, staring into the lens. Reading something. A speech. One he never gave in court. But the words? They'll change everything. What if the most terrifying thing about an arrest isn't the handcuffs, but the relief on the suspect's face? Because when police finally stepped into the guest house that night, they weren't met with chaos. They were met with stillness. And that stillness would haunt everyone who saw it. The door opened slowly. Not kicked in. Not forced. Unlocked. As if Nick Reiner had been expecting them all along. The officers announced themselves. No response. They moved in carefully, weapons drawn. Not because Nick had threatened them, but because the silence was wrong. Too deliberate. Too composed. Then they saw him. Nick was seated on the couch, back straight, hands folded loosely in his lap. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't crying. He looked finished, like someone who had just closed the final page of a book. On the television in front of him, the end credits of Stand By Me were rolling. He didn't turn around when the officers entered. He just said, "I was wondering when you'd come." Not defiant. Not sarcastic. Matter of fact. As if this was the next scheduled event. The officers ordered him to stand. He did. Slowly. No resistance. No questions. As the cuffs went on, one officer later testified that Nick exhaled. Deeply. Like someone setting down a heavy weight. That detail stuck. Because most suspects panic. Some rage. Some collapse. Nick did none of that. He looked lighter. And that terrified them. As they escorted him outside, neighbors had already gathered behind police tape. Phones out. Whispers spreading. Nick didn't look at them. He didn't scan faces. He didn't search for sympathy or fear recognition. He stared straight ahead. And as he passed the patrol car, he said something so quiet only one officer heard it. "I don't have to pretend anymore." That officer wrote it down immediately. Because even then, it didn't sound like a confession. It sounded like closure. At the station, the calm didn't break. Nick complied with everything. Fingerprinting. Photographs. Paperwork. When asked if he wanted a lawyer, he nodded. When asked if he understood his rights, he said, "I understand structure." That was it. No follow-up. The interrogation room was small. Fluorescent lights. Bare walls. One table. 2 chairs. Nick sat down before being told. He placed his hands flat on the table. Centered. Symmetrical. When the detective entered, Nick looked up and smiled faintly. Not a grin. Not mocking. More like recognition. "Are we doing this now?" he asked. "Or later?" The detective paused. "Doing what?" Nick tilted his head slightly. "The scene," he said. "Let's pause here. Because this is where the narrative fractures. This is where the case stopped being just about evidence and started being about psychology. Because Nick didn't deny anything. But he also didn't explain. Instead, he performed restraint. And that restraint unnerved everyone. The detective asked the first question. "Nick, can you tell us what happened tonight?" Nick considered it, then said, "Which version?" The detective clarified. "The truth." Nick nodded. "The truth," he repeated, slowly, "is that nothing happened suddenly." He leaned back. This was a long time coming. Over the next 2 hours, Nick spoke in fragments. Not answers. Fragments. He talked about silence. About being watched. About being edited. He never once said the word kill. He used phrases like, "It ended." The conflict resolved. The tension broke. When the detective pushed back, asked directly whether he had harmed his parents, Nick finally looked confused. "Harmed," he echoed. "I didn't harm them. I stopped the noise." That line sent chills through the room. Because it wasn't aggressive. It was philosophical. At one point, the detective slid a photo across the table. Not graphic. Just confirmation. Nick glanced at it. Didn't flinch. Didn't tear up. He just said, "They look peaceful." The detective asked how he could say that. Nick replied, "Because the scene is finally quiet." Now here's where it gets even more disturbing. Nick asked a question of his own. Is my sister okay? The detective said yes, physically. Nick nodded, then added, good. She was never supposed to be in this. That sentence alone raised red flags. In this how? The detective asked him to clarify. Nick shook his head. No spoilers, he said. She'll understand later. After the interrogation ended, Nick was placed in a holding cell. Still calm, still silent. But that's when something changed. When he was alone, a guard later reported hearing Nick speak, to no one in particular. Not loudly, just enough to hear through the door. I did it clean, Nick said. No improvisation. Then a pause. Then, that's the difference between chaos and meaning. The guard requested a welfare check. Psych evaluation. Immediately. The psychiatrist arrived early that morning. Reviewed the preliminary notes. Spoke to Nick for just 20 minutes. When she exited the room, her face was pale. She told the supervising officer, he doesn't present as psychotic. He presents as resolved. Resolved. That word would appear again and again in reports. Not unstable. Not delusional. Resolved. Which terrified the prosecution. Because insanity defenses rely on confusion. Nick wasn't confused. He was clear. When news broke later that morning, headlines exploded. Beloved director. Shocking crime. Son arrested. But Nick didn't watch the coverage. He declined television. Declined phone calls. Declined visits. Except one. From his lawyer. The first thing Nick asked him wasn't about charges. It wasn't about sentencing. It was about timing. When do I get to speak? Nick asked. Where people can hear me? The lawyer hesitated. In court, he said. Nick nodded. That's fine, he replied. I've been rehearsing. And rehearse he did. Over the next few days, Nick began writing again. Not scripts. Statements. Notes. Margins filled with arrows and pauses. Words circled. Crossed out. Rewritten. He wasn't preparing a defense. He was preparing a delivery. One guard described it like this. He wasn't scared of prison. He was scared of being misunderstood. Think about that. Not scared of punishment. Scared of the wrong interpretation. Then came the arraignment. The courtroom was packed. Media everywhere. Cameras flashing. The judge called the room to order. Nick was let in. And for the first time since the arrest, his calm cracked. Just slightly. Not fear. Something else. Anticipation. As he took his seat, Nick scanned the room. Found his sister. Their eyes met. Romy looked away. Nick didn't. When the charges were read, 2 counts of first-degree murder, Nick didn't react. No gasp. No outburst. Just a slow inhale. And then, when the judge asked if he understood the charges, Nick stood up, unprompted. And that's when everything changed. Because instead of answering yes or no, Nick turned toward the gallery, toward the cameras, toward the world, and said, he wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. Gasps. Shouting. The judge slammed the gavel. But Nick wasn't done. His voice rose, not with rage, but with precision. Every word measured. Every syllable sharp. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a monologue. And the courtroom had just become his stage. Mini cliffhanger ending. As deputies rushed toward him, Nick added one final line. So quietly it barely registered. A line that wasn't in the police reports. Not in the transcripts. But was heard by a court stenographer, who froze mid-keystroke. Nick said, I didn't kill my parents in that house. Pause. Then, I killed the lie. And with that, the deputies took him away. But the damage? Already done. Because in the next chapter, we'll break down that courtroom eruption, line by line, and uncover what Nick really meant when he said his father was only playing a role. And trust me, once you hear the full speech, you'll never hear that family story the same way again. What happens when a courtroom stops being a place for justice and becomes a stage? Because the moment Nick Reiner stood up without permission, something shifted. Not just in the room, in the story. Up until that second, this had been a case. Evidence. Charges. Procedure. But when Nick turned toward the cameras and spoke that line, he wasn't a father. He was a director playing a role. The courtroom stopped being a courtroom. It became an audience. And Nick knew it. The judge's gavel came down hard. Mr. Reiner, sit down immediately. Nick didn't. Deputies moved closer, hands hovering, unsure whether to intervene or wait. The prosecutor froze mid-sentence. Reporters leaned forward, pins suspended in midair. Romy sat rigid in the front row, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. This wasn't part of the script. Except it was. Nick had been rehearsing this moment for months. And now, finally, the lights were on. Mr. Reiner, the judge warned again, voice sharp, this is not the time. Nick raised a finger. Not aggressively. Not rudely. Almost politely. Your Honor, he said, this is the only time. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The judge stared at him, incredulous. You will sit down, he said, or I will have you removed. Nick nodded. I understand, he replied calmly. But before you cut the mic, let me finish the thought. Finish the thought. That phrasing mattered. It wasn't a plea. It was a writer asking for one more line. The judge hesitated. That hesitation would later be dissected by legal analysts, psychologists, and media commentators for weeks. Why didn't he stop Nick immediately? Some said it was shock. Others said curiosity. A few whispered something darker, that even authority figures get caught in the gravity of performance. For 3 seconds, no one spoke, and Nick took them. I grew up watching my father tell stories about love, justice, loyalty, Nick said, his voice steady, projecting naturally into the room. People cried at his movies. People told him he understood humanity. He paused. I watched those movies too. A murmur moved through the gallery. Nick's eyes flicked briefly toward Romy, then back to the cameras. But the man who made them, he continued. He didn't know how to talk to his own son unless it sounded like a review. The judge banged the gavel again. Mr. Reiner. Nick turned slightly, still not sitting. Every conversation was a lesson, he said. Every silence was a note. Every failure was rewritten as my fault. The prosecutor stood, objecting loudly. Your Honor, this is highly inappropriate. Nick looked at him. Not with anger. With curiosity. Inappropriate, he asked. So was my childhood. The courtroom erupted. The judge finally ordered deputies forward. But before they reached him, Nick delivered the line that would dominate headlines for weeks. He wasn't a father, Nick said louder now. He was a director. And I was just another role he couldn't stop rewriting. The room exploded. Shouts. Flashbulbs. The judge yelling for order. Deputies grabbed Nick by the arms, pulling him back toward his seat. But Nick didn't resist. He let them guide him. And as they did, he leaned slightly toward the microphones, just enough, and added, you don't need a motive when the whole life was the setup. That sentence never made it into the official transcript, but it made it into everything else. Court was recessed within minutes. Nick was removed from the room. The judge retreated to chambers. And the media? The media went feral. Within an hour, every network was running the clip on a loop. Pundits argued whether Nick was manipulative or mentally unwell. Psychologists debated whether the speech indicated narcissism or trauma. Legal experts warned that the outburst could damage any potential defense. But none of them asked the most important question. Why did that speech feel prepared? Because it was. During the recess, Nick's lawyer confronted him in the holding room. What the hell was that, he demanded. Do you have any idea what you just did? Nick looked at him calmly. I delivered the premise, he said. Now we build. The lawyer stared at him. This isn't a movie. Nick tilted his head. No, he replied. It's better. Movies end. This gets discussed forever. That line chilled the lawyer more than any confession could have. Back in the courtroom, when proceedings resumed, Nick was silent. Composed. Almost serene. He didn't speak again that day. But the damage, or the impact, had already been done. Because jurors aren't robots. They hear tone. They see posture. They feel tension. And several jurors would later admit, off the record, that Nick's words stayed with them. Not because they agreed, but because they felt rehearsed. And that suggested something deeply unsettling. Outside the courthouse, Romy finally spoke. Not to cameras. To a friend. She whispered. He's been waiting his whole life to say that. That sentence reframed everything. Because this wasn't a breakdown. It was a release. Later that night, a leak surfaced. A partial transcript from Nick's private psychiatric evaluation, conducted days before the arraignment. One line stood out. The psychiatrist asked Nick what he hoped to accomplish in court. Nick's response, I want the audience to finally understand the character. The psychiatrist pressed him. Which character? Nick smiled faintly. All of us. And then something unexpected happened. A reporter, digging through Rob Reiner's old interviews, found a quote from years earlier. a quote that had never seemed important before. Rob had once said, "The hardest thing about directing is knowing when to let your characters speak for themselves." That quote went viral, side by side with Nick's courtroom speech. The internet exploded. Coincidence? Or cruel irony? But the most haunting moment didn't happen in front of cameras. It happened in a side hallway. As Nick was escorted back to the holding area, he passed Romy. Their eyes met. Just for a second. She mouthed one word. "Why?" Nick stopped walking. The deputies tightened their grip. Nick looked at her, not with anger, not with resentment, with sadness. And he said something so softly, only she heard it. "I needed you to see me." Then he walked away. That night, Nick returned to his cell. He asked for pen and paper. The guard hesitated, but allowed it. Nick wrote one sentence, folded the paper carefully, and slid it under the door. It read, "Act 2 complete." The next morning, prosecutors received something unexpected. Not from Nick, not from his lawyer, but from an anonymous source. A flash drive. No return address. No note. Just a label written in shaky handwriting. Deleted scene. And what was on that drive? Was a recording no one was supposed to hear. A conversation between Rob and Nick. Recorded months before the murders. A conversation that may prove Nick wasn't lying when he said his father was always directing. Because in the next chapter, we're going to play that tape, line by line. And once you hear it, you'll understand why the courtroom went silent.